They say 10 years of marriage is a milestone, but for me, it felt like a warning. At the start of our relationship, everything with Eric had been so easy. We were the couple everyone envied, the inside jokes, the late-night conversations, the way we seemed to anticipate each other's needs without saying a word. But over the past year, things had started to shift. Our connection felt thinner, stretched taut over the weight of responsibilities, unspoken resentments, and the creeping monotony of everyday life. I couldn't pinpoint when it started, but suddenly, everything felt fragile. Eric and I had always been good at handling life stresses together, or at least I thought we had. But now, it felt like we were walking parallel paths, close, but not touching. He worked long hours, often coming home too tired to talk. I tried to keep myself busy, throwing myself into hobbies and meetups with friends, but the silence between us grew louder. Sometimes, I'd sit on the couch at night, flipping through old photos on my phone, the beach trip where we built sandcastles like kids, the time we danced in the kitchen to a song we both loved. I missed that version of us. Then, I met Adam. It wasn't planned, of course. I was sitting alone at a coffee shop, trying to find the energy to tackle the day, when he approached me. He wasn't flirtatious or overbearing, he just seemed kind. "Mind if I sit here?" he asked, gesturing to the empty chair across from me. "Go ahead," I replied, expecting him to pull out a laptop or scroll through his phone. Instead, he struck up a conversation. At first, we talked about the little things, the best coffee spots in town, the unpredictability of the weather. But as the minutes ticked by, our conversation deepened. There was something about Adam that made me feel seen, as if he could read between the lines of what I was saying and find the parts of me I hadn't shared with anyone in years. Over the next few weeks, I found myself looking forward to our accidental meetings at the coffee shop. They were always unplanned, but Adam had a way of showing up just when I needed someone to talk to. One afternoon, as we sat by the window watching the rain, he asked, "Are you okay?" The question caught me off guard. I'd spent so long pretending to be fine that I didn't know how to answer honestly. "I'm trying," I said finally. Adam didn't push me to elaborate, but his silence invited me to keep talking. Before I knew it, I was sharing things I hadn't even admitted to myself, about the cracks in my marriage, the loneliness I felt, and the way I sometimes wondered if I'd lost a part of myself along the way. I don't know when our connection crossed the line from innocent to something more. Maybe it was the day he brought me a book he thought I'd like, or the time he brushed a strand of hair from my face as we laughed about something silly. But the moment I realized I was in trouble came one evening as we walked through the park. The air was cool, the leaves crunching under our feet, and for the first time in months, I felt alive. Adam turned to me, his eyes searching mine. "You deserve to feel this way," he said softly. Before I could stop myself, I leaned in, and our worlds collided in a kiss that felt both electric and terrifying. That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind was a storm of emotions, guilt, confusion, exhilaration. I loved Eric. I knew that with certainty. But the connection I felt with Adam was undeniable, and it made me question everything I thought I knew about myself and my marriage. The next morning, as I sat across from Eric at the breakfast table, I felt a pang of guilt so sharp it nearly took my breath away. He didn't deserve this. "Everything okay?" he asked, his voice laced with concern. "Yeah," I lied, forcing a smile. But deep down, I knew the truth would come out eventually. In the days that followed, I tried to avoid Adam, hoping that distance would help me sort out my feelings. But the weight of what had happened lingered, a constant reminder of the line I'd crossed. One evening, as Eric and I watched a movie together, he reached for my hand, and I felt tears prick the corners of my eyes. I wanted to tell him everything, to confess and beg for his forgiveness, but the fear of losing him kept me silent. Instead, I resolved to figure out what I wanted, who I wanted, before making a decision that could change everything. The days after my kiss with Adam were an emotional blur. I tried to throw myself into the routines of my marriage, cooking dinner, catching up on household chores, sitting with Eric on the couch in the evenings, but nothing felt the same. It was as if I were living two lives, one where I was the devoted wife and another where I was someone who had betrayed the person she loved most. Adam had been respectful of the distance I tried to create, but it wasn't long before our paths crossed again. This time, I wasn't sure I had the strength to keep my feelings in check. It happened on a Friday evening as I walked out of the grocery store. Adam was there, leaning against his car, his expression soft but determined. "Caroline," he said, his voice steady. "We need to talk." I wanted to brush him off, to tell him that now wasn't the time, but the look in his eyes stopped me. "Okay," I said reluctantly, gesturing toward a bench nearby. As we sat down, Adam turned to face me. "I'm not here to complicate your life," he began. "But I need to know, what are we doing? Because I can't stop thinking about you." His honesty hit me like a tidal wave. I looked down at my hands, unable to meet his gaze. "I don't know," I admitted. "I'm so confused, Adam. I love my husband, but I feel something with you that I can't ignore." For a moment, there was silence between us, heavy with the weight of what we both knew but couldn't say. "I won't push you," Adam said finally. "But you need to figure out what you want. For your sake, and for his." At home, Eric began to notice the shift in my demeanor. He wasn't the type to pry, but I could see the worry in his eyes whenever I seemed distant or distracted. One evening, as we sat across from each other at the dinner table, he said, "You've been quiet lately. Is everything okay?" His question made my stomach twist. I wanted to tell him the truth, but how could I? Instead, I forced a smile and said, "Just stressed from work." Eric nodded, but I could tell he didn't fully believe me. Desperate for clarity, I reached out to my best friend, Emma. She was the only person I trusted enough to share the full story with, and I needed her perspective. As we sat in her living room, I told her everything, about the cracks in my marriage, the way Adam had made me feel alive, and the guilt that was eating me alive. "Caroline," she said after a long pause, "you're in a tough spot. But you can't keep living like this. You need to decide what's worth fighting for." Her words stayed with me long after I left her apartment. In the days that followed, I made an effort to reconnect with Eric. I planned a surprise date night, something we hadn't done in months, and hoped it might reignite the spark that had once been so strong between us. As we sat at our favorite restaurant, sipping wine and reminiscing about the early days of our relationship, I felt a glimmer of hope. For the first time in weeks, it felt like we were on the same page again. But as the evening wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still missing. Despite my attempts to focus on my marriage, my thoughts kept drifting back to Adam. One afternoon, as I walked through the park, I spotted him sitting on a bench. He didn't see me at first, but when our eyes met, I felt a rush of emotions, longing, guilt, and something else I couldn't quite name. I hesitated, then walked over to him. "I didn't plan this," I said as I sat down. "Neither did I," he replied. We talked for hours, sharing pieces of ourselves we hadn't shared with anyone else. By the time I left, I felt more conflicted than ever. That night, as I lay in bed next to Eric, I realized I couldn't keep living this double life. I had to make a choice, whether to fight for my marriage or take the risk of pursuing something new with Adam. The thought of losing Eric was unbearable, but so was the idea of living with a secret that could destroy him. The next evening, I sat Eric down and told him the truth, not everything, but enough for him to understand the weight of what I was feeling. "I've been struggling," I said, my voice shaking. "And I met someone who made me question everything." His face fell, and I saw the hurt in his eyes. "Are you saying you don't love me anymore?" "No," I said quickly. "I do love you. But I feel like we've lost something, and I don't know how to get it back." Eric didn't say anything at first. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm but firm. "I want to fix this, Caroline. But I need to know you're willing to try, too." Over the next few days, Eric and I began to have the hard conversations we'd been avoiding for months. We talked about what had gone wrong, what we needed from each other, and whether we could rebuild the trust that had been fractured. Meanwhile, I distanced myself from Adam, knowing that I couldn't move forward with Eric while keeping one foot in another relationship. It wasn't easy, but it felt like the right thing to do. The days after my confession were some of the hardest I'd ever experienced. Eric and I were navigating uncharted territory, unsure of how to move forward but unwilling to let go of what we'd built over the past decade. Our conversations were raw and emotional, peeling back layers of hurt, fear, and longing. It felt like standing in the ruins of something once beautiful and trying to imagine how it might be rebuilt. One of the first things Eric and I agreed on was that we needed to be brutally honest with each other, about our feelings, our fears, and what we wanted moving forward. "I don't want to lose you," Eric said one evening as we sat at the kitchen table, a cup of untouched tea between us. "But I need to know that you're committed to fixing this." "I am," I said, my voice trembling. "But I also need to be honest with myself about why I let this happen in the first place." I knew that to have any chance of repairing my marriage, I needed to create distance between myself and Adam. I sent him a message explaining that I couldn't see him anymore, not because he'd done anything wrong, but because I owed it to Eric and to myself to focus on my marriage. His reply was kind but brief: "I understand. I wish you nothing but the best." Letting go of Adam felt like closing a door on a part of myself I hadn't even realized was open. It was painful, but it also brought a sense of clarity. At Eric's suggestion, we started seeing a marriage counselor. Dr. Carter was calm, empathetic, and unflinchingly honest, which was exactly what we needed. In one session, she asked, "What do you think was missing in your relationship that led you to seek connection elsewhere, Caroline?" Her question hit me like a punch to the gut, but I knew it was important. I felt invisible, I admitted. Like we were going through the motions but not really seeing each other anymore. Eric's face softened, and for the first time, I saw the guilt he'd been carrying. "I guess I didn't realize how distant I'd become," he said quietly. As we worked through our issues in therapy, Eric and I began to rediscover the parts of each other we'd taken for granted. One evening, we decided to revisit the restaurant where we'd had our first date. It was a small, cozy place with dim lighting and a menu that hadn't changed in years. As we sat across from each other, laughing about how nervous we'd been that night, I felt a flicker of the spark that had brought us together in the first place. "We've come a long way," Eric said, reaching for my hand. "And we still have a long way to go," I replied, squeezing his fingers. Rebuilding trust wasn't a linear process. There were moments of progress, like the time Eric surprised me with a handwritten note telling me how much he appreciated me. But there were also setbacks, like the evening he asked if I'd heard from Adam and my hesitation made him question whether I was being honest. "I need to know I can trust you again," he said, his voice tinged with frustration. "I know," I said. "And I'm doing everything I can to prove that you can." One of the most surprising things about our journey was how much the small gestures mattered. Eric started making an effort to be more present, putting his phone away during dinner, asking about my day, and planning little surprises like a movie night with my favorite snacks. I, in turn, made an effort to show him how much I appreciated him, leaving notes in his lunchbox, initiating conversations about things I knew he cared about, and making time for the activities we used to enjoy together. One evening, as we sat on the couch after a particularly emotional therapy session, Eric said, "Do you ever think about him?" His question caught me off guard, but I knew I owed him the truth. "Sometimes," I admitted. "But not in the way you think. I think about how he made me realize what I was missing, and how much I want to find that with you instead." Eric nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I don't want to be the person who made you feel invisible," he said. "And I don't want to be the person who betrayed your trust," I replied. The breakthrough came one evening as we sat on the porch watching the sunset, a ritual we'd adopted to create space for open conversations. "I feel like we're finally starting to understand each other again," Eric said, his tone hopeful. Me too, I said, smiling. And I don't want to take that for granted. In that moment, I realized how far we'd come, not just in rebuilding our relationship, but in rediscovering the love that had always been there, waiting for us to nurture it. As the weeks turned into months, Eric and I continued to make progress. The wounds we'd inflicted on each other were still there, but they were healing, slowly but surely. One evening, as we walked through the park where Adam and I had shared our first kiss, I felt a sense of closure. This place no longer held the weight of betrayal, it was just a park, nothing more. I'm ready to move forward, I said to Eric, my voice steady. Me too, he replied, taking my hand. The weeks after Eric and I recommitted to each other felt like a cautious dance. Each step forward was deliberate, careful not to misstep and fall back into old habits. But amidst the uncertainty, there were moments of real joy, glimpses of the relationship we were working to rebuild. I hadn't realized how much of myself I'd lost in the cracks of our marriage. Reconnecting with Eric meant reconnecting with myself, too. It wasn't just about being a better partner, it was about being a better version of me. One of the ways we began to strengthen our bond was by creating new traditions. It started small, a weekly game night where we'd play cards or try out board games we'd never heard of. One evening, as we sat on the living room floor surrounded by snacks and dice, Eric looked at me and said, "I forgot how much fun we used to have." Me too, I admitted, smiling. These little traditions became our anchor, a reminder that rebuilding didn't have to be all heavy conversations and hard work, it could also be about rediscovering what made us happy together. After months of focusing on our relationship at home, Eric suggested a weekend getaway. Just the two of us, he said, handing me a brochure for a cozy cabin in the woods. The idea was both exciting and nerve-wracking. Being alone with Eric, away from the safety of our routines, meant confronting our relationship in a new way. The trip turned out to be exactly what we needed. We spent our days hiking through the forest, our conversations flowing easily as we marveled at the changing leaves. In the evenings, we cooked dinner together, laughing over burnt garlic bread and sharing stories we hadn't thought to tell each other before. "This feels like us again," Eric said one night as we sat by the fire. "It does," I agreed, my heart swelling with hope. Despite the progress we'd made, life didn't stop throwing challenges our way. Work stress, family obligations, and the lingering tension of rebuilding trust tested us in ways we hadn't anticipated. One evening, after a particularly long day, I snapped at Eric over something trivial. His immediate response wasn't anger but concern. "What's really going on?" he asked, his tone gentle. His question reminded me of how far we'd come. Instead of shutting down or lashing out, I took a deep breath and said, "I'm just overwhelmed. But I didn't mean to take it out on you." "It's okay," he said, pulling me into a hug. "We'll figure it out." Moments like these made me realize how much stronger our foundation had become. One afternoon, Eric surprised me with a small gift, a journal. "I thought it might help you process everything," he said, his eyes warm. The gesture was simple but meaningful. I began using the journal to write down my thoughts, both the good and the bad. It became a space where I could reflect on our journey and remind myself of how much we'd overcome. One evening, as I flipped through its pages, I realized how far I'd come, not just in my relationship with Eric but in my own growth. A few months later, Eric suggested something that took me by surprise. "I think we should renew our vows," he said one evening as we sat on the porch. "Really?" I asked, my heart skipping a beat. "Yeah," he said. "I think it's important for us to reaffirm what we mean to each other, especially after everything we've been through." The idea filled me with a mix of excitement and nerves, but I knew he was right. The ceremony was small, just the two of us in a quiet park near our home. As we exchanged vows, I felt a renewed sense of commitment, not just to Eric but to the life we were building together. While things with Eric were improving, I couldn't ignore the occasional pang of guilt when I thought about Adam. He had been a catalyst for so much change in my life, but I knew I'd made the right decision in letting him go. One day, while walking through the coffee shop where we'd first met, I saw someone who looked like him. My heart skipped a beat, but when I realized it wasn't him, I felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. That night, I told Eric about the encounter. "I don't want there to be any secrets between us," I said. "I appreciate that," he said, his voice steady. "And I trust you." His words were a reminder of how far we'd come, and they filled me with gratitude. As the months turned into a year, Eric and I began to talk about the future with a sense of excitement we hadn't felt in years. One evening, as we cooked dinner together, he said, "What do you think about taking that trip to Italy we always talked about?" The idea of a big adventure felt both daunting and thrilling. "Let's do it," I said, smiling. Planning the trip became a new project for us, something to look forward to as we continued to build the life we wanted together. Through all the ups and downs, Eric and I rediscovered something we'd thought we'd lost, the deep, unwavering love that had brought us together in the first place. It wasn't perfect, nothing ever is, but it was real, and it was ours. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sunset, Eric took my hand and said, "I'm proud of us." "Me too," I said, squeezing his hand. In that moment, I realized that the journey we'd taken, painful, messy, and ultimately beautiful, had made us stronger than ever. By the time Eric and I renewed our vows, it felt like a turning point, a moment where we stopped looking back at what had broken us and started focusing on what was possible. The scars were still there, but they were a testament to the resilience we'd found in ourselves and in each other. Now, life felt like an open road, full of possibilities we hadn't dared to imagine during our hardest moments. But as we began to explore what came next, new milestones brought their own challenges and opportunities. Planning our trip to Italy became a joint effort, and it brought us closer in ways I hadn't expected. We spent evenings poring over travel guides, debating itineraries, and practicing basic Italian phrases that often left us laughing until tears streamed down our faces. When the day finally came, stepping off the plane felt surreal. The cobblestone streets of Rome, the rolling hills of Tuscany, the canals of Venice, it was everything we dreamed of and more. One evening, as we sat at a small cafe overlooking the Amalfi Coast, Eric took my hand. "I'm glad we waited for this," he said, his voice soft. "Me too," I replied, smiling. The trip wasn't just a vacation, it was a celebration of everything we'd worked for, a reminder that life could still be full of wonder and joy. After returning from Italy, the question of starting a family came up more often. It wasn't something we'd talked about seriously in years, but now it felt like a natural next step. One evening, as we sat on the porch, Eric broached the topic. "What do you think about having kids?" His question caught me off guard, but it also filled me with a sense of hope. "I think I'd like that," I said, my voice trembling with both excitement and fear. Over the next few months, we began to explore what that might look like, whether it meant trying for a baby, considering adoption, or even fostering. The conversations weren't always easy, but they were honest, and that made all the difference. Around the same time, Eric was offered a promotion at work. It was a big step up, but it also came with more responsibility and the possibility of longer hours. "I don't want this to take away from what we've built," he said one evening as we discussed the offer. "I think you should go for it," I said. "We've figured out harder things than this, and I'll support you every step of the way." His gratitude was evident, and seeing him thrive in his new role brought me a sense of pride I hadn't anticipated. As life grew busier, finding balance became more important than ever. We made a conscious effort to prioritize time together, whether it was a quiet evening at home or a spontaneous weekend road trip. One Saturday, we decided to revisit the park where we'd exchanged our renewed vows. As we walked hand in hand, Eric said, "I think we're finally figuring this out." "Better late than never," I teased, laughing. His smile was warm. "I wouldn't trade this journey for anything," he said. Though things were better than they'd been in years, there were still moments when the past resurfaced. Sometimes it was in the form of an old memory, or a fleeting pang of guilt when I thought about how close we'd come to losing everything. One evening, as we sat by the fire, Eric said, "Do you ever think about him?" His question caught me off guard, but I knew honesty was the only way forward. "Not in the way I used to," I said. "I think about what he represented, a wake-up call. But I'm grateful for where it led us, even if it was painful." Eric nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I guess I'm grateful too, in a way. It forced us to confront what we were avoiding." Over time, Eric and I became more intentional about celebrating the small victories in our relationship. Whether it was finishing a tough project at work, making it through a stressful week, or simply having a good day, we found ways to acknowledge each other's efforts. One evening, as we cooked dinner together, Eric said, "You know, I think we're happier now than we've ever been." I smiled, feeling the truth of his words. "I think you're right," I said. As we approached our 12th anniversary, Eric surprised me with a handwritten letter. "Caroline, these past 2 years have been a journey I never expected, but I wouldn't trade them for anything. You've shown me what it means to fight for love, to grow together, and to create a life worth living. I'm so proud of us, and I can't wait to see what the future holds." His words brought tears to my eyes, and I realized how much we'd accomplished, not just in rebuilding our relationship, but in rediscovering ourselves along the way. As Eric and I sat on the porch one evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in years. "We've come a long way," I said, leaning against him. "We have," he agreed, wrapping an arm around my shoulders. "And I'm excited for what's next," I added, smiling. "So am I," he said, his voice full of warmth. In that moment, I knew that our story wasn't just about the mistakes we'd made or the pain we'd endured, it was about the love we'd chosen, again and again, and the life we were building together. Life with Eric had become a beautiful, unpredictable journey. It wasn't without its challenges, every relationship has them, but we'd learned how to face them as a team. The days of feeling disconnected, like strangers sharing the same space, were behind us. Now, our relationship felt alive. We laughed more, shared more, and made each other a priority in ways we hadn't before. It wasn't perfect, but it was real, and that was more than enough. After months of conversations, planning, and a little bit of hesitation, Eric and I decided to start trying for a baby. It was a big decision, one that carried equal parts excitement and fear. When the test came back positive one morning, I could hardly believe it. "Eric," I called, my voice shaking as I held the tiny stick in my hand. He rushed into the bathroom, his eyes wide with concern. "What's wrong?" I couldn't speak, so I handed him the test. The realization dawned on his face slowly, and then he broke into the biggest grin I'd ever seen. "We're having a baby," he said, pulling me into his arms. "We're having a baby," I echoed, tears streaming down my face. Pregnancy was a whirlwind of emotions, joy, anticipation, and the occasional wave of anxiety. Eric was my rock through it all, attending every doctor's appointment, calming my nerves when the slightest thing went wrong, and indulging my cravings for late-night ice cream runs. One evening, as we assembled the crib in the nursery, Eric looked at me and said, "I think we're going to be pretty good at this." I laughed, holding up a set of instructions that made no sense. "Let's see if we can survive putting this together first." Moments like these reminded me of why I'd chosen to fight for us. Eric wasn't just my husband, he was my partner in every sense of the word. The day our baby was born was a blur of exhaustion and overwhelming love. Holding our tiny daughter in my arms, I felt a kind of joy I couldn't put into words. Eric sat beside me, his eyes filled with awe as he cradled her for the first time. "She's perfect," he said softly. "She is," I agreed, my heart full. That night, as we sat together in the hospital room, watching her sleep, I realized how far we'd come. This little life was a symbol of everything we'd built together, the love, the resilience, the hope. Life as new parents was both exhilarating and exhausting. The sleepless nights, endless feedings, and constant worry tested us in ways we hadn't anticipated. But through it all, Eric and I leaned on each other. When I was too tired to function, he stepped in. When he felt overwhelmed, I reassured him. One night, as we rocked our daughter back to sleep after yet another 3 a.m. wake-up, Eric turned to me and said, "We make a pretty good team, don't we?" "The best," I replied, smiling despite my exhaustion. As our daughter grew, so did our relationship. We made an effort to carve out time for just the two of us, knowing that staying connected as a couple was just as important as being good parents. We'd take turns planning date nights. Sometimes it was as simple as ordering takeout and watching a movie after she fell asleep, but those moments of connection kept us grounded. One evening, as we sat on the porch with a glass of wine, Eric said, "I'm proud of us, you know. We've been through so much, but here we are." "Here we are," I agreed, leaning into him. Life, of course, wasn't without its curveballs. A few months later, Eric's company faced budget cuts, and his position was one of the ones affected. "I don't want you to worry," he said as he broke the news. "We'll figure this out." I knew he was trying to be strong for me, but I could see the weight of it in his eyes. "We will," I said, taking his hand. "And you don't have to carry this alone." Over the next few weeks, we worked together to adjust our budget and explore new opportunities for him. It wasn't easy, but it brought us even closer. Eventually, Eric found a new job, one that not only paid well but also gave him more flexibility to spend time with our family. To celebrate, we planned a small getaway to the mountains, bringing our daughter along for her first family vacation. Watching her giggle as she played in the grass, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in years. "This," Eric said, wrapping an arm around me as we watched her from a blanket on the ground, "is what it's all about." "It is," I agreed, smiling. As our daughter grew and our life settled into a steady rhythm, Eric and I began to dream about the future again. We talked about taking her to Italy someday, about the possibility of expanding our family, and about the kind of legacy we wanted to leave behind. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sunset, a ritual that had become a cherished part of our lives, Eric said, "I feel like we've finally found our place." "Me too," I said, smiling. In that moment, I realized how much we'd built together, not just a family, but a life full of love, resilience, and hope. As the years passed, our life settled into a rhythm that felt like home. There were still challenges, of course. Life has a way of keeping you on your toes, but Eric and I had learned how to face them together. Our daughter grew into a spirited, curious little girl who brought light and laughter into every corner of our world. Watching her discover life made everything feel new again, and it reminded me daily of how grateful I was for the life Eric and I had worked so hard to build. One evening, as we sat on the porch after putting our daughter to bed, Eric turned to me and said, "Do you ever think about how far we've come?" "All the time," I replied, smiling. He nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I don't think I realized how strong we were until we had to rebuild everything from scratch." His words brought tears to my eyes. "We didn't just rebuild," I said. "We made something even better." As our daughter grew older, Eric and I became more intentional about the lessons we wanted to teach her. One evening, as we helped her with a school project about family traditions, she asked, "What's the most important thing about being married?" Eric and I exchanged a glance, smiling at the simplicity of her question. "Communication," I said. "And never giving up on each other," Eric added. Our daughter nodded, her expression serious as she scribbled our answers onto her paper. Watching her, I felt a surge of hope for the kind of person she would grow up to be, someone who valued love, resilience, and connection. Over the years, Eric and I continued to celebrate the milestones that marked our journey, anniversaries, birthdays, and the little victories that made life sweet. On our 15th wedding anniversary, Eric surprised me with a scrapbook filled with photos, notes, and mementos from our life together. "I wanted us to have something to look back on," he said, his voice soft. As I flipped through the pages, I was struck by how much we'd shared, the highs, the lows, and everything in between. "This is beautiful," I said, tears streaming down my face. "So are you," he replied, pulling me into his arms. As our daughter entered her teenage years, Eric and I found ourselves facing new challenges, navigating her growing independence, balancing our own needs with hers, and figuring out how to support her without hovering. One evening, as we sat on the porch, our favorite place to talk, Eric said, "She's growing up so fast." "I know," I said, my heart aching with both pride and nostalgia. "But I think we're doing okay," he added, smiling. "We are," I agreed. With our daughter growing older, Eric and I began to dream about what the next phase of our life might look like. "We should take that Italy trip with her," Eric said one evening as we planned our next family vacation. "She'd love it," I replied, smiling at the thought. It felt good to think about the future, not as something to fear, but as something to embrace. One evening, as we sat by the fire after a long day, Eric handed me a small notebook. "I've been writing down little things I want to tell her someday," he said. Inside were notes filled with wisdom, encouragement, and memories, advice about love, resilience, and the importance of staying true to herself. "You're amazing," I said, touched by his thoughtfulness. "So are you," he replied. As I looked around at the life we'd built together, a life full of love, laughter, and the occasional misstep, I realized how far we'd come. Eric and I weren't just partners, we were a team, a family, and a testament to what happens when two people refuse to give up on each other. "We've done pretty well, haven't we?" Eric said one evening as we watched the sunset. "We have," I replied, smiling. "And I wouldn't trade a single moment of it." In the years to come, our daughter would grow up and create her own life, but the lessons we'd taught her, the ones we'd learned through our own struggles and triumphs, would always be with her. And as Eric and I sat together, reflecting on the life we'd built, I knew that our story wasn't just about us. It was about the love we'd shared, the resilience we'd shown, and the legacy we'd leave behind. It wasn't perfect, but it was ours. And that made it beautiful.